Welcome to the second episode of Stories from the Field, our new interview series where we interview some of our incredible Harkn community members about how they got to where they are today and all of the experiences and things that they learned along the way. So today's guest is Natalie Thompson, who we first met when she was in charge of all things Wellbeing, CSR and EDI at Schroders Personal Wealth, who are one of our client organisations. But she is now leading employee relations at the law firm DAC Beachcroft. So Natalie was our primary contact for Harkn's use of SPW and a brilliant champion for both usage of the platform, but also creating healthier and more inclusive workplaces where every employee can reach their full potential. So she's a very passionate and committed professional, and I'm really excited to get to know more about you on this journey. So welcome, Natalie.
Hi, really pleased to be here today.
So I like to start off these interviews with the same question for everyone, which is, what was your first ever job and your first ever sort of experience of the world of work?
Wow. So if you want me to be absolutely honest, my first ever job, and it's relevant, I believe, which is why I'm going to use it. I was a Saturday girl in a hairdresser's, which exposed me to people.
Yeah, brilliant. Did you enjoy it?
So I didn't enjoy the obvious parts about it, but what I really enjoyed was the talking to people, listening to people, making that sort of small talk conversations, and it very quickly led me to kind of get to know that everyone is an individual and what's right for some people isn't right for others. And I was very young, so I think it shaped my views about being a people orientated person.
Yeah, which definitely leads me nicely into my second question, which I guess lots of people always know what they're going to do in life, and then other people come at it from a whole roundabout way. So what led you to roles in the kind of people field? Did you always know you were going to do that? Did it happen incidentally?
I think my first proper job, if you like, when I kind of left school, college, was in financial services. So I've kind of grown up in that arena for many years, and it was client facing, customer facing roles. You know, being young, you tend to start that way in the client-facing position and kind of work your way up. And I just had a natural ability to talk to people. So I think that's initially kind of what led me in. Having said that, I didn't find it natural being a people manager initially. I found that kind of challenging because I had my own views on how things should be done. So that was a bit of a conflict for me in my kind of early career, if you like, in the sense of, I was a great people person, but I probably wasn't a great manager to start with, and I kind of had a lot of learning to do. And along that journey came those opportunities, there was that exposure to understanding the differences in people from a diversity perspective, from a attitude to, well-being, and attitude to sickness, and also how different people, more senior people to me, were managing people. So I think that kind of diversity there helped shape me in understanding how to be a better leader myself, but also how I wanted to be managed, and really started to get me to try and understand and listen to people.
Love that. Yeah, I love that you say that it didn't come naturally to you at first, because I think a lot of people feel like that, and the kind of route to being a people manager is, again, really different for everybody. So then you can find yourself in that position and think, oh, actually, this comes with a whole different set of circumstances. But the idea of HR, and I know because you were at Lloyd's before, and that was more of a traditional HR role, and then you've done all the wellbeing and CSR stuff, and now employee relations. Do you feel, when you first started, do you feel like HR was really meant something quite different to it does today, or how has it evolved?
Definitely. And I think from, it continues to evolve is what I would say, and certainly in different sectors it's also still evolving and also going to be different. There is a perception that human resources, people management it's kind of, oh, well, that's HR's job. But I think it's moved away a long way from that, and certainly from in the role of HR from a people strategy perspective, and understanding that, you know, your people are your biggest asset, and kind of having that view from the top, you know, that involving people in those business decisions right from the start, and understanding the impacts of those is going to actually lead to better results and better performance. But it hasn't always been like that. And I think certainly, you know, a lot of things have occurred in the last 5-6 years that have increased the speed of which the profession's adapted as well. I mean, the concept of working from home and working remotely, there is still in some areas this perception that actually, do we trust people? Rather than looking at it from actually what can we provide an individual to ensure they're engaged and motivated when they're working remotely. So all of those conversations are kind of all forced upon us, weren't they, 4 years ago, and you know, a lot of that's contributed to the evolution. I think the workplace is and continues to change. There's different views now. Some organisations are going completely remote, and some organisations are encouraging their workforce to go into the office on set days a week or certain days a week, because that ability to collaborate and have conversations has a massive impact on engagement and well-being as well as performance. And I think for me, you know, HR's adapted as well, because we now, I think, have more credibility in terms of from a business perspective, in that we can kind of have that positive impact on performance. But in order to get there, I think, you know, it's understanding the role that leaders and managers play in that on the ground, listening, kind of wanting to keep your team members informed and involved. Doesn't mean to say, you know, anything that's critical, confidential, but yeah, be kind of in touch with how they're feeling and in touch with what matters will make the difference between a change landing and being successful. And you know, the impacts on that, rather than seeing a dip. So I think in summary, HR continues to evolve, but is now kind of seen much more as not just a cost to a business, but actually can add value.
Yeah, I think that you're so right. It's not just that what people are doing in HR has changed, but the perception of HR and other areas like internal communications has really changed over the last few years, because I think other areas of business realise like quite how vital it is and how much of an impact it has on other areas of the business. But I love that you, whenever you talk about leadership, there tends to be the word listening in there, which is why you're such a brilliant advocate for Harkn. But in terms, was listening sort of seen as a leadership skill from what you remember early on? Is that quite a new concept?
I don't think it was called out specifically. And in fact, you know, a lot of command and control environments, you know, tell do, you know, that perception of kind of being listened to perhaps, you know, hasn't evolved, you know, as much in certain organizations or certain sectors. And it wasn't necessarily as understood as, you know, the active listening, the participation, and not just listening at the, you know, the annual survey time and then putting an action plan together and this is how we'll resolve it. I mean, really listening to kind of, for people to feel informed and involved. It increases engagement by results, so that, you know, if you feel as though you're being listened to, and then by your direct line manager, and they understand you, then that trust and openness is going to be built, isn't it? And then, you know, your commitment to the organisation is going to be there, and you're not going to feel like that fear of kind of being singled out, for example. I think there's a lot of that, and it's not just listening on its own. It's demonstrating you're listening and understanding, because, you know, otherwise, you know, anybody can listen, but if that doesn't lead to anything, then what's the point? You know, it's active listening and actually engaging in that, you know, wanting somebody's opinion, and then engaging in a conversation around what actually matters. I think that's the important thing. So I think there's more awareness of it, and there's still a little bit of kind of maybe nervousness around it, because, you know, if you've got more active voices and stronger voices in the organisation that have a big impact on the culture, then it could have a negative effect. I think you've got to have the right kind of champions around to kind of reinforce and build that kind of listening environment, so that they can manage the naysayers, if you like, and manage those people who maybe want to be disruptive. It's not about that. It's about for the good of the organisation and to make it, the right place to work, where people then can thrive and deliver, very strong performance, because that's what we're about at the end of the day. Any organisation is there, to deliver outcomes and great, whether it be great service or products or whatever. And you can only do that if you've got great people who you understand.
Yeah, and we're obviously very familiar with that kind of nervousness of what happens when you like untap all of these voices. But I think it's a real, listening is not just a policy. It's like it's a fundamentals kind of mindset shift, because traditional leaders are taught that they go away and make a decision and communicate it out. So it takes a lot to kind of shift the way that you're thinking about that. But I imagine one of the reasons you've had such a successful career is that it's always about balancing those business needs with, or seeing them as inextricably linked with these concepts. And I think that's what we're always trying to do, is reconcile those two things in people's minds and see that they're not at odds with each other. They're actually very much reliant on each other. That people feeling, it comes back to trust and all of those things. And it has to be really embedded in your ways of working, not just kind of paying lip service to things like listening. I
think just on that, Lydia, I think it's not just embedded in your ways of working, it's kind of embedded in my character.
Yeah.
So, I'm a naturally curious person. And you mentioned at the beginning of this, I'm still relatively new in a new organisation, a different sector, and for me, it's about being curious and listening myself, not necessarily coming up with all these ideas, because I need to understand how things are done around here. And that's really, really important to me, because, if I'm going to have credibility and have any impact, I need to demonstrate an understanding of the environment that I'm working in as well.
Absolutely. Curiosity is essential. And what do you, in terms of, it could be your current job, or it could be more generally, what do you consider sort of most rewarding, and what is most challenging?
So from a rewarding perspective, feeling, strangely, feeling as I've made a connection is the first thing for me. If I've made a connection and made a difference. So if I've helped somebody, if I've signposted somebody, if I've influenced somebody into thinking things differently, or if I've overcome, a challenge and, influenced, a different way of thinking, for example, or come up with a solution, those that can see from a commercial perspective, it's not just around, well-being for a long time has had the perception of being the fluffy stuff. For me, it's a fundamental foundation structure of an organisation, because the well-being of your people, like I said earlier, your biggest asset, and it's kind of seen as something separate, then it's not going to have as much impact. So for me to kind of have that impact where it's understood that it's not something separate, it's all part of the commercialism of an organisation, and that how it impacts on our performance, then that's the rewarding part of it. The most challenging part is, people aren't interested sometimes. There's they're not got a growth mindset, they're fixed in their opinions, and they're not, they don't see that it's going to make a difference. So whilst that's challenging, I don't necessarily find it negative. It's more around, okay, now isn't the time. Do I need to give it, adapt my approach, or come back later. It's not all about making a successful outcome immediately. It's the different time frames, but also I think it's challenging because sometimes those old-fashioned approaches to things have worked so well for so many years. So why would somebody want to see that they need to change? Because what they've always done has always worked in their eyes. So I think that is a challenge in itself, because what I'm not about is, I'm not somebody who's about to be, a solitary leader in that sense. It's, for me, it's about gaining people, and a bit like starting a movement, and it's about just subtle changes. And I think sometimes that can be quite challenging when people don't have kind of they don't want to change because it's safe to stay where they are.
Yeah, I think we can really relate to that. And I think actually the reward and the challenge are very interlinked, because the more set in their ways people are, you know, I think we all know that the world is sort of moving in the right direction slowly but surely and in kind of incremental steps. So I guess every sort of hurdle that when you win somebody over to that way of thinking and get them to see it as a positive, then it's ever more rewarding. So the bigger the challenge that you need to overcome, the more satisfying it is when you kind of break through. And that also, because you mentioned well-being a lot there, and it's something that is really being talked about all the time at the moment. There's lots of new viewpoints on it, and I think especially there's now a view that kind of the individualistic well-being treatments aren't the answer to workplace well-being. So we all do things in our lives, like forms of self-care and kind of making ourselves more resilient and manage our emotions better, but the relationship between that and the challenges we come up against in the workplace and how that impacts on employee well-being is not a direct relationship. So you've worked in the well-being space for a long time. I assume it's still a big part of what you do in your current role.
It is, yes. Yeah.
So how do you see it? What do you see the sort of near future on the ground as you are? What's changing?
It's interesting because, you know, having lots of interventions and activities and things that colleagues can access, it is great, just like you mentioned, but it isn't the answer, because we all kind of have our own personal preferences and things that we do. I think the focus really is when you balance a highly targeted environment, which is, you know, if you've paid on results, if you like, so, you know, you might be sat in a salaried role, but actually you're judged on the outcome, and particularly in the sector I'm in at the moment, that is kind of a real focus. So a long hours culture, and, you know, not taking breaks, you know, the basic fundamentals, because actually they've got a deadline, are the areas that is now got a spotlight on. You know, how can we get kind of a healthier culture around this? I mean, I don't need to tell you that actually the more busy you are and the more pressured you are, that tendency to I haven't got time to take a break, I've got to get this deadline done, actually is counterproductive, because you're going to be less productive if you don't take a break. But actually, when you're in that situation, I've been in it myself, you don't think like that. You think, I'll just do a bit more, I'll just do a bit more because I need to do this, I need to do this. So I think things like that, and actually having that, you know, the senior leadership example, so normalizing it and not just kind of it being trotted out as this is the thing we're focusing on this month, but it actually becoming embedded in, and people talking about how they manage challenging situations. I think that's the difference that it's going to make in terms of healthier workplaces, and people will get to understand that culture. You get a feel for what the culture is by the small talk, whether that's on a Teams call or whether that's physical in an office environment. And I think that's going to be the future really of workplace wellbeing, and having the courses, having the, you know, the example days, or the you know, the things that you can do inside and outside work, and having the interventions and the support definitely have their place. But it's does it feel like on a day and then I think calling out the really good examples and embedding that as a practice to be, you know, it is going to make that difference, because you know, we're all individuals, like you said, and actually, you know, nobody should be told, you know, like enforcing, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, because that's going backwards in my opinion. However, kind of it's the implicit things, and I think senior leaders, you know, CEOs, you know, C-suite have got a big role to play in that. And I think the organizations that kind of create that culture where it's all part of your working environment, you know, we want you to be delivering your best work, and to do your best work, then it's kind of, this is the environment we want to be in. I think that's the way forward. Yeah,
leading by example, certainly in wellbeing. And when you're looking at high pressure sectors like law and financial services, like you know, if the company communication says, we want everybody to look after themselves and take breaks, but you also know that you might not get put forward for that project, or you might, seem inferior in some way, like you can only learn from, you look around you, look at what people are doing, look at what your boss is doing. Are they taking breaks? And
Totally.
if it, as you say, if it's not embedded, it very quickly kind of falls apart in terms of a well-being strategy.
I'm a very big advocate of storytelling as well. So, without going into too much detail, that's something that I've worked on previously, and you do get, senior role models sharing what they do, and like you say, walking the talk. That does have the biggest impact, because, this fear of, if I do this, I'm not going to get put for promotion, or I'm not going to get the bonus, or I'm not going to be seen as, because I'm only doing this, that it's kind of will flip it, I think, and recognizing and celebrating those scenarios, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and when senior leaders are brave enough to kind of tell their own story, it has a massive impact on kind of dismantling the stigma that, and there's not the same stigma that there was like 20 years ago, but there is always still a stigma, even if it's very sort of subtle, on, you've admitted that you're not coping very well. It's really difficult for people to do in a professional environment. So
this goes back to my earlier point, Lydia, around what sort of people manager, what sort of leader, and not always getting it right. I think being open to feedback, and people might not call it feedback, they might call it something else, but I think it's around that, there is a responsibility in all of us, and it isn't just one way. As an individual, team member or a manager, it's both have got equal kind of accountability, I think, for this. But it's breaking down those barriers and stigmas so that you feel safe and not be judged. But equally, as a manager, if you're not familiar with that, that's always been HR's role, for example, to have those conversations, that equally is going to be a challenge as well. And I think taking those steps to changing the style is not an easy one, but I think having some leaders that lead by example is definitely going to help that.
Absolutely. And in terms of transitioning from kind of one size fits all wellbeing policies to a more targeted approach, where do you see the sort of intersection between listening at an organizational level and empowering that kind of support?
I think, well, going back to having, looking at where I'm working at the moment and the kind of structure and the approach there, from a location, from a cluster perspective, having those role models in those senior roles, sharing their kind of anecdotes and stories has a massive impact. And I think learning from each other. So I think that's one element of it. And actually having those role models follow up as well. So it isn't, for example, just this is the flavour this month, this is the thing that we really want to listen to you, then following up with outcomes of, well, a bit like you said we did. So we said we wanted to listen, this is what I listened, and this is what we're doing. And I think those sorts of activities are definitely going to make a difference, but it then needs to be embedded so it becomes the norm. And I think that's where the biggest success will be. And I think intersectionally as well, so you mentioned inclusion, I think that is an area of further development that organizations, are the successful organizations that are kind of increasing that focus are seeing the benefits of that, because the stigma, the barriers are there and will continue to be there. They're not going to be eradicated, but those vulnerabilities that you mentioned before, and people feeling safe and kind of putting the head up above the parapet and kind of being happy to share, is going to continue to make that positive difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure the different roles that you've had have made it very clear that you can't treat things like diversity and inclusion as completely separate from things like well-being, because
they're all interlinked. Absolutely. Equality, and diversity is in everything that we do. And I think we need to have it integrated more, and I think that's definitely happening, to be an inclusive environment. what's right for one person isn't necessarily right for another, but actually it's having that understanding as well. And things like unconscious bias, blind spots, which we've all got, it's kind of part of human nature. Those understanding of those elements can have a positive impact on the well-being and inclusion of an organisation.
So we've touched on you've worked across a few different sectors, financial services, law. Do you feel when organisations are trying to make progress in these areas, and obviously they all come with their own set of circumstances, whether it's like the working model that they follow, the types of clients that they work with, what kind of significant differences have you been exposed to, and how have you kind of adapted for different environments? And I guess to sort of, is it possible for any sort of sector to make meaningful progress with this sort of work?
But my answer is yes, but I think it's the speed of the progress, and also then celebrating where progress has been made. So in my current organisation, there's different sectors, different clusters, there's different kind of specialisms, and so understanding if one area has adopted something and that's working, sharing it and finding out about it, and kind of encouraging other areas to adopt that, is definitely going to make a difference. Certainly the kind of common denominator is, when it's kind of it's a fee-based environment and your chargeable hours, then that's not going to go away, and that's that kind of the thing that runs across all of the those. But it's kind of understanding the peaks and troughs of the workload, the support mechanisms that are in place, and I suppose the confidence in speaking out, and also the line manager capability, to spot the signs and signposts and have those kind of safe conversations, notwithstanding this, I don't want to be judged because I don't want to have this perception that I'm not coping. And I think that the journey is there, and way down the road, and I think the speed of which the progress is made is dependent upon your immediate local environment. And I think that's where the challenges come. And kind of, for me, it's about engaging with the right people and understanding their styles, their what's worrying them, and kind of having those healthy, challenging conversations, and actually giving examples of why it would work. I think because that changing mindsets, as you said right at the beginning, is really difficult, because there's so many kind of different elements, and to add something else in could be perceived as, well, that's just giving me something else to think about, instead of creating an environment where actually it's a holistic view to well-being. It's a holistic view to an inclusive workplace environment. And I think that's a commitment that comes from the top, and then it needs to kind of be engaged from all of the workforce as well. And I think it's maintaining that with having your groups, your networks and things like that, and it's how it all plays that individual part and comes together. So it's not it's kind of integral on a day-to-day basis, and that's the benefit of talking and listening, seeing the benefits of that.
What you've highlighted well there is it's not just how different organisations might compare or different sectors, but when you're dealing with big organisations, which Harkn typically does, it's the cohesion within the organisation, and that's why culture and any kind of culture change or progress is really difficult to navigate, because you're not just dealing with one cohesive group of people, but typically distributed or different locations, and those challenges have only got more difficult in some ways since we've become much more digital, much more kind of distributed in our ways of working. But I suppose whatever industry or organisation you're in, they all have one thing in common, which a whole new generation is coming into their kind of junior ranks now, which is exciting and is bringing with it a whole new set of considerations. So what are your thoughts on that, and kind of how organisations might need to adapt or position themselves if they kind of want to welcome this new generation?
I mean, there is a lot of information around Gen Z and the better work-life balance, and also potentially unfair perceptions of kind of a little bit of not being able to cope, which
Yeah.
I think I'm saying potentially unfair because that labeling isn't helpful. There is some research which kind of identified that kind of higher levels of stress and anxiety in that population, but any research is only as good as the people that have contributed towards it. But we have to listen and have to kind of take that on board. And I think what's happening is that that certain generation taken from the research are demonstrating that, as they have been in the sense of that commitment to stay, that longevity. Nobody has a job for life anymore. I see it as all part of that bigger picture. And maybe what this generation is bringing to the workforce is actually helping with what we've just been talking about questioning and being a bit more curious around, because values, I haven't mentioned values, but my values of kind of integrity and respect drive me, and fairness and kind of being valued. Those are the kind of key things that have driven me throughout my career. But there's a lot of assumptions that people make, and I think having that ability to challenge those assumptions, or I suppose not just the ability to challenge the assumptions, but also having the vulnerability and the courage, if you like, to challenge those assumptions is what's making the difference. And I think, again, speaking for my current organisation, we've recently had a round of promotions, and I kind of look at the age profile, the demographic, the gender, and I'm really proud of of what I see. And I think it's all around the culture that we generate that kind of brings people on and they want to stay, because it's around, okay, how are we adapting? We're adapting by listening, and we won't always get it right, but actually by sharing those successes and evidencing listening to those scenarios. So looking at people returning from adoption or maternity, for example, or parental leave, and what support do they need, and what perspectives, and in terms of how often have you had contact whilst you've been off work. There's a lot more voice around that now than there ever was. So I think those are the areas that the organisations that are going to be most successful are going to be listening to that, and actually actively going out and engaging with role models. That's definitely something we've done recently, and obviously committed to doing. So I think that don't want to pigeonhole Gen Z, but use them as an example, in terms of perspectives and experiences, because I'm the other end of the extreme. I'm one of the kind of the older aged workforce, if you like, and we've got is it 5 or 6 generations in the workforce now. That is where there's a big challenge, because you have your kind of your old school perceptions, we've always done it this way, and then you've got your challenging the work-life balance versus you stay and work long hours and you get the reputation, and that's where it's the challenges. And I think it's looking at the whole picture, not just the whole new generation. I think for me it's like looking at all of the generations and how you can learn and benefit from all of those.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is a challenge, but there's also a real opportunity to see it as an opportunity, and having so many different perspectives in the workplace at one time. And age is perhaps a lot of people are talking about it at the moment, but it's not traditionally core to the kind of inclusion piece, where perhaps that's something that will change, is that because if that's sort of left unchecked, that can create some really sort of unpleasant workplace dynamics.
Again, it goes to stereotypes and perceptions.
And
I think being comfortable, working in an environment where you're comfortable to challenge that. And when I say challenge, I mean in the right way, not aggressive. And I think that's where maybe the skills need to be built, and having those human, intelligent, but yet kind of fair conversations is a skill. Because if you're worried about saying the wrong thing, then you're more likely to say the wrong thing. And asking questions, and and kind of having the preempt, I'm curious, I want to understand, You know, there's that that saying, isn't there? You know, you need to listen to understand rather than listen to respond. Whereas actually it's human nature to listen to respond. If you're already preparing your response when you're listening to somebody, you're not really listening. And that, that's really difficult to do. But that, I think that's one area where I've really tried hard to do much more of.
Yeah. Well, it has to be like parts of it are human nature, and when you're under pressure, especially at work, I think there's some interesting research into how unconscious bias is amplified by burnout, because your brain is sort of short-circuiting on all of these like assumptions, and kind of that really making a conscious effort to take the time to find out more about people, as you might do perhaps more outside of work, and to sort of build those relationships, I think will be really important going forward. But that brings me to our final question, which is the same for everybody, is that we talk a lot about the age of the listening organisation at Harkn, which is something that's definitely well underway, but we think is also going to come to the fore in the near future. So I wanted to ask what that term means to you, from your experiences working with us, working in your current role.
I think a listening organisation for me is an organisation that actively values all of their colleagues, employees, whatever the terminology is that use, in the sense of they're actively going out and wanting input from their individuals, whether that's directly, whether that's through managers, whether that's through polls and questionnaires, but then coming back with how that's going to impact on and change the culture. And one where I think it's understood that it's a moving piece, that collaboration is the way forward. I think it needs to be relevant to obviously the organisation and where the organisation is on that journey, but it's about being courageous and brave, but also understanding that, you know, stereotypes and perceptions and prejudices, you know, are always going to be there. It's kind of understanding, are those impacting my decision? Are those impacting my judgment of a situation or an environment? And I think it's an organisation where you have role models and leaders, not just senior leaders, but of all levels across an organisation. I think that is the key thing. You know, from the top down and bottom up, because everyone has a contribution to make.
Brilliant response, Natalie. We will save that one and share it for sure. Thank you so much. It's been a great interview. So many interesting insights into everything you've learned, and you're definitely a really inspiring professional in this field. So thank you so much for agreeing to do it.
Thank you. My pleasure.